I'm really excited right now to introduce one of the few politicians that I actually admire. I'm talking about Congressman Dennis Kucinich, one of the most honest, credible politicians who ever served, a man who spent his 18-year tenure fighting for the issues that Americans care the most about. From the war in Iraq to the food we eat, Kucinich has always stood on the right side, the side of truth, which is why I'm honored to have the chance to speak to Congressman Kucinich himself. I first asked him about oil being a motivating factor for the Iraq War, particularly in light of Bush's former speechwriter coming out to validate that claim. And here's what he had to say.
Well, right from the beginning, it was very clear that there was no legitimate reason to go into Iraq. The only compelling reason would be to try to help corner the market on oil. It didn't work out that way for those who thought that it would. But the fact of the matter is, oil was so well known as to be a motivating factor that when I ran for president in 2004, going across the country, I'd ask audiences, tell me what this is about, this war is about, in 3 letters. And thousands of people would respond simultaneously, oil. It was never a secret.
Right. In 2007, Congressman, you actually introduced articles of impeachment against George Bush and Dick Cheney. When you look at things like Nixon being ousted for wiretapping, Clinton being ousted for an affair, how is it that these 2 men could not be held accountable for initiating an illegal war based on known lies?
Well, I think we have to place the responsibility for that on the shoulders of Democratic leadership, because we could have moved forward with an impeachment, but the Democratic leadership wouldn't do it. Now, there has to be accountability in a democracy. It is widely understood today that war was based on lies. So then, should not, since the catastrophe of the war resulted in thousands of Americans being killed, tens of thousands injured, maybe 1 million innocent Iraqis died, perhaps damage in the hundreds of billions of dollars to Iraq, shouldn't there be some accountability? And so what I've called for is a process of truth and reconciliation, like South Africa had many years ago, where leaders are required to come forward and state their role in the decision-making process, and if they lie, then they're subject to perjury charges. We need to clear the air in America. We need the truth, and it is since everyone knows it was based on a lie, then what's wrong with calling those who lied to us forward to not only require explanation, but to clear the air?
Absolutely. I remember Pelosi at the time saying impeachment was off the table. I mean, could it be that the Democratic leadership was scared that they would open their can of worms and somehow be complicit in the lies?
Well, you know, 2/3 of the Democrats voted against going to war. But the third that did vote for it were involved, as were their counterparts in the Senate, in establishment-type politics that favored war. Right. Some of the leading senators who have become, exalted public figures, took a stand for that war. And they've never been held accountable, even politically. Interestingly enough, it would seem as though to be qualified to speak on foreign policy, even still today, that you have to have been for the war, even though it was based on lies. That's the kind of upside-down thinking that continues to guide foreign policy decisions in Washington, D.C.
Well, speaking of upside-down policy, Obama's reason for not prosecuting or even investigating the Bush officials was because he wanted to look forward, not backward. However, I can't help but wonder why he continues to look backward to prosecute those who exposed war crimes as whistleblowers instead of the war criminals.
No good deed remains unpunished. And those who were the whistleblowers are being punished. Those who took us into a war based on lies are being celebrated. This inversion of reality is Orwellian. It needs to be reckoned with. And that's why I call for this period of truth and reconciliation. And you know what? Isn't all law enforcement about looking backwards?
Exactly.
Hello.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about the Afghanistan war in terms of looking backwards. It was sold to us as a war of necessity in a post-9/11 world. Of course, Bush at the time had a 95% approval rating. I don't blame people for voting for it, thinking that we needed some form of retaliation. But did you find the logic flawed now, looking back? Do you regret your vote to invade and occupy a country to find one man?
No, we did not. Congress did not vote to invade and occupy. They voted to give the president the ability to respond to the attack on 9/11. And frankly, I think it was appropriate that the United States struck at the training camps and made the point that you're not going to attack the United States with impunity. Stop there. End of story. Not invade and occupy and basically try to break a country that hasn't been successfully conquered in modern times. So this too points to the serious flaws in our foreign policy. We have an obligation to defend this country. And I don't take a backseat to anyone in saying that if America's attacked, we have a right to defend ourselves. But it was criminal to go and think that we're going to knock off Afghanistan, occupy it, control it, remake a country where a lot of it's just a box of rocks. And what do we think? Who do we think we are? This was a major flaw. It's hubris, arrogance, and we need some explanation to the American people.
Absolutely. Let's talk about your presidential run in 2008. Both you and Ron Paul were pretty much the leading anti-war figures, of course, on both sides of the spectrums of both parties. I remember leftists and libertarians at the time calling for you guys to be running mates because you were so united against the wars and for the restoration of our civil liberties. Now these factions are so divided. They're more divided than ever before, and it just seems like without any representation to have us, these dividing factions fighting each other instead of the forces that we should be fighting against is really counterintuitive. How do you think it got to be this way, and how could we unite these factions to really focus on cohesive, unified opposition again?
Well, I think that what Ron Paul and I proved is that there's plenty of space in American politics for a new movement which goes across partisan lines, which embraces the concerns of Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, that's based on the truth, on protecting the Constitution, on taking care of our practical aspirations here at home, and of sharply curtailing this aggression that America has practiced around the world. So I think, Ron Paul and I have been able to demonstrate this capacity of creating new possibilities. And frankly, since the two parties continue to fail to address America's economic problems, I think that the American people increasingly will be looking towards alternatives as we move towards the future.
I call it the two-party dictatorship, Congressman. Let's talk about civil liberties, which is something that you have been very vocal about in your entire term. Rand Paul, his epic filibuster, not really supported by a single Democrat. I mean, how is it that drones and due process are a partisan issue now?
Well, they shouldn't be. And what happens in Washington is this. Whatever party holds the White House, their supporters in Congress try to protect the president of their party. But the president isn't just the president of a party, he's president of the United States. And members of Congress aren't just partisan participants in a process, they are United States congresspersons. And what we have to remember is that both myself and Ron Paul, Rand's father, raised this issue of the drones in the Congress relentlessly, brought a resolution in front of the Congress, forced a committee to have to consider it. And, this is finally people are starting to understand there are constitutional issues here. And good for Senator Rand Paul for raising the issue on the floor of the Senate, but we haven't resolved it. Other countries are going to start to use drones. Imagine for a moment if China thought that or any other nation thought that they could invade U.S. airspace with a drone as we invade other people's airspace. We wouldn't stand for it. How can we expect other countries to continue to stand by while we violate their sovereignty and their territorial integrity? And then on a domestic level, we got to worry about the domestic use of drones. Won't be long, mark my words, that law enforcement domestically will start using these drones to go after suspects using armed force. Yeah, and they're counterintuitive abroad. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to see that killing people with drones is not a good way to fight, quote, terrorism. You served an epic 18-year run in Congress. You were one of the most vocal leaders against the establishment line time and time again. When you were redistricted, did you feel that you were deliberately gerrymandered out of office because of your politics? By the Democrats, not by the Republicans. Wow. It was Democrats in the Ohio legislature who went out of their way to totally distort the map in Ohio and to cut my district up into 4 pieces, making it impossible for me to win. Now, I can tell you, I don't have any, it's just a fact. I'm not bitter about it. I still have a home in Washington, a home in Cleveland. I can occasionally see the light of the Capitol on. I just want to know who's home.
unbelievable when your own party, turns against the ideals that this country was founded on. When you did leave, Congressman, the media portrayed you as fringe. I mean, they even called you the congressman with the most wacky ideas, yet the majority of Americans support what you stood up for. How is it that this depiction is even allowed to exist, and what damage does it do when people feel like they're marginalized for sharing views that you had?
Well, one, it doesn't hurt my feelings. Two, it never changed my position. And when you stand up for the truth, it's very easy to understand that you take on certain interest groups who are going to try to marginalize you. It is interesting, as you point out, that someone would try to characterize as fringe, having opposed the war in Iraq based on facts, having challenged those who made the decisions that cost our troops and our nation and the Iraqi people so dearly, having challenged other wars, and have proven to be right again and again and again. But you know what that means? If the truth is at the fringe, then what position is being celebrated?
Exactly. Exactly. And you speaking from an inside perspective, you've been inside the system for so long. When you look at things like Monsanto, like Vermont not even able to pass a labeling law because of the fear of a lawsuit from Monsanto. I mean, you also were one of the only people to try to get GMOs labeled.
1999.
What does this say? Do corporations essentially have more power than voter resolutions, and how do
Yes. After Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United, corporations took enormous power over our government. Monsanto, look, they were able to get the Bush administration in its waning days to be able to claim that, the first Bush administration, to be able to claim in 1993 that genetically modified organisms are the functional equivalent of conventional food. No science based on that at all. But the dollar bill has a science all of its own. And so now you have hundreds of millions of acres of crops that have been planted with genetically modified organisms used to do that. And our markets are closing in Europe as a result, where people don't want these crops to come in. And even more than that, we have no idea as to the effects with respect to allergenicity, toxicity, functional characteristics, antibiotic resistance. We're part of a grand experiment now in our food. This is another one of the reasons why I eat organic and I'm a vegan.
Indeed we are, and thank you for bringing those fringe ideas to the mainstream and standing up for the truth that so many of us don't have a voice to share in the system. Thank you so much, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, huge fan.